Thank you very much indeed, Patrick, and many thanks to George and Roland for absolutely fascinating presentations. I'm going to, as the title suggested, I'm going to focus on Africa. My wife Janice and I were fortunate to live in Tanzania for 11 years from 1989, and we've just returned from a visit to Tanzania and Kenya, taking in our work in health, agriculture, and access to finance. And the progress made by both countries, and I think particularly of Tanzania, since we lived there is absolutely astonishing. Malaria, which I've done quite a lot of work on both in the UK Parliament and elsewhere, which was a deadly threat in the 80s and 90s, has reduced sharply. Communications are much better. We travelled 2,500 kilometres on excellent roads, which hardly existed in the 1990s. There were regular internal flights. Again, they didn't exist before. In 1989, when I first started working in Tanzania, international phone calls cost a minimum of $21 each. Now, mobile phones and internet are everywhere and hence almost free, and border crossings are so much more efficient. The cities outside the capital and the tourist hotspots are also very much improved. I went to Mwanza, Dodoma, Kisii, Nanyuki. They were all thriving with good hotels serving local and regional travelers. I'm more convinced than ever that it's necessary to build long-term, constructive, respectful partnerships, both with the continent as a whole through the African Union and individual sovereign states. And those partnerships need to be at all levels: government, institutions, businesses, social and cultural. But why Europe and Africa? Doesn't the same apply to Europe's relationships with all continents? It certainly does, and we've heard about that. But I think there are particular reasons for Europe and Africa to become closer at a time of great power rivalry. The most important reason is that we're close neighbours and on similar longitudes. Most major centres are within 3 to 8 hours flying time, apart from the most southerly points of Africa and the most northerly of Europe. And the maximum time difference is 3 hours. There are several other important reasons, though. Unlike Asia and the Americas, there are no existing or emerging superpowers in the regions. So in building partnerships, no country is being forced to take sides in great power rivalry. Both continents have a high number of UN member states, 54 in Africa, 44 in Europe, by the UN calculations, together comprising just over half of UN member states for approximately 25% of the world's population. Now, I'm not suggesting that all states will work together as a bloc, but that there is every incentive to form as much common ground as possible through sheer weight of numbers in the United Nations. And of course, Africa has the youngest and fastest growing population, which is increasingly educated to high school and now graduate level, and is highly entrepreneurial in my experience, but currently lacks the investment to enable these young people to make the most of their skills. Europe has a fairly static population, around about 700 million, with a high skill base and large pools of investable capital, very little of which is currently deployed in Africa. I point out here, though, that the UK still has the largest pool of investment in Africa of any country in the world, at about $64 billion, followed by France. So European countries are still taking the lead, although China is rapidly catching up, and that's by UNCTAD figures. So helping African entrepreneurs to create the jobs and livelihoods needed by young people, in my view, is the single most important contribution at the moment which we can make to breaking the cycle which leads some to put themselves in the hands of people smugglers. At the same time, providing safe and legal opportunities for work in sectors in Europe which are crying out for staff works for everybody. And there are strong personal and cultural links. French, English, and Arabic are common languages for many. The African diaspora in Europe is increasingly strong, while openness to investment is bringing more Europeans to make their home in Africa. Christianity and Islam coexist across much of both continents and will have to grow in mutual understanding if civil peace is to be maintained. Parliamentary democracy in various forms has spread across most of both continents in the past 35 years, and states in both continents have very much to learn from each other's experience and mistakes. Europe in particular can learn much from community-based approaches rather than a focus on the individual, while the invaluable concept of a loyal opposition, so essential to parliamentary democracy, needs to become rooted in countries where parliamentary political opposition is considered verging on treasonous. And finally, there's the environment, climate change, and food security. Africa, the continent, has the potential to be an agricultural powerhouse and a leader in the agroforestry approaches which are essential for sustainable food production. Its tens of millions of small farms long regarded as a disadvantage, will become an advantage if, with the support of European businesses, they have greater access to finance and technology. I'd like now to look closely at some of those areas for partnership. Firstly, the politics. As has already been spoken about, most African states are non-aligned. They do not consider that they must choose between the US-led Western Bloc and China/Russia. A country like Djibouti is quite happy to host military bases for the United States, China, France, Italy, Japan, and Saudi Arabia within a short distance of each other. The response to that is to engage constructively for several reasons. Talking is always better than not talking. Relationships are prized, perhaps more than in our increasingly individualistic society. Working in non-aligned countries often also provides opportunities for contact with countries with whom Europe has serious disagreements, when these would not be possible on a bilateral basis. African states are becoming increasingly important in peacemaking and diplomacy, not just on the continent of Africa, but across the world. They have, for instance, noticed how both Russia and Ukraine have sought their diplomatic help during the current conflict. Kenya, often seen as pro-Western, was very happy to welcome Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently. Secondly, business and the economy. The major challenge facing most African economies is or underemployment of young people, a consequence of demographics. The population is currently 1.2 billion, expected to reach 2.4 billion by the mid-2060. By far the most opportunities for employment are created in small and medium enterprises and the informal sector. From my personal experience, the key problem is lack of access to finance, particularly for productive equipment. I chair a leasing business in Tanzania, which friends and I set up 20 years ago, and now has the support of KfW, the German Development Bank, and AgDevco, which is a UK government-owned institution. I've just returned from visiting some of our branches and spoke to two businesses in Mwanza. They have taken several leases for machinery and vehicles over a number of years. They made it clear that without this equipment finance, their businesses would never have got off the ground. Between them, they now employ 100 people, and I'm of the firm opinion that a competitive leasing and broader SME finance sector across Africa would help people create very large numbers of job opportunities every year. Increased employment in the health sector is another area for cooperation. Millions more professional jobs could be created if all African countries employed nurses, midwives, and doctors at even half the density in Europe. By my calculation on the UN basis, on the UN WHO figures, 4 million more nurses and midwives and 2.5 million more doctors at just half the density, based on the current population of 1.2 billion, let alone the increased population. As co-chair of the Kenya-UK Health Alliance, I see the increasing collaboration between UK universities, medical schools and trusts, including both Liverpool University, Liverpool Trust, and the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and those in Kenya, which have increased in number from 3 to about 12 in the last 15 years alone. That either is being or can be replicated across the continent. A Tanzania-UK alliance has just been established, the Uganda alliance has flourished for a decade, and a Nigerian one is in the pipeline. Thirdly, health and education. In addition to supporting the dozens of new medical and nursing schools needed with their curriculum development, for instance, Manchester University has a big program in Egypt, there are numerous opportunities for partnership. One which I have a particular concern about, as I chaired the UK parliamentary group on malaria and neglected tropical diseases, is tackling the 20 neglected tropical diseases. These affect about 1.7 billion people worldwide, with a high percentage being on the continent of Africa. They can be fatal, such as snakebite, but are more often disabling, leprosy, onchocerciasis, trachoma, or debilitating, soil-transmitted helminths, lymphatic filariasis, for instance. In addition to the suffering, they result in substantial economic loss to the people affected in their countries. Most can be prevented by chemoprophylaxis, and European countries have been at the forefront of providing free of charge the billions of drug doses needed for these programs. All that is needed is additional funding, estimated at only about $700 million a year. To put that into context, my local hospital trust in Stoke-on-Trent has a budget of greater than $700 million a year, and that is covering 1 billion people in the UK, let alone 1.7 billion people globally. And these would supplement the drug donation programs and ensure effective distribution. The UK, the US, and Germany have led on this, but funding has been sharply reduced, which is a great backward step and a great shame. There's a great opportunity for the UK and Europe to work together with our African partners to end the threat of these diseases. The target is 2030. We could still hit it, at least to reduce to 10% of their current levels. And finally, of course, the environment and combating climate change. The new EU Deforestation Directive, which has just come into force, will be a test case for cooperation. Will it just become a stick with which to beat African and Asian and Latin American agricultural producers, the vast majority of whom are smallholders? Or will it become a genuinely cooperative endeavour to protect forests, cut carbon emissions from agriculture while enhancing the incomes of tens of millions of smallholder farmers producing the coffee, cocoa, rubber, soy, palm oil, beef and wood covered by the directive? If the former, expect to see African producers increasingly turning away from supplying Europe and towards the more forgiving regimes and markets of Asia and even the US. And I've seen that, I'm afraid, already. So how can this and other environmental initiatives be cooperative, work with African countries and respect their sovereignty? To take one example, encourage them to establish credible national certification schemes, and I'm talking here about agriculture, which are locally staffed and recognized internationally. They don't exist at the moment, or hardly exist. So here are four broad areas in which the countries of Africa, the African and European continents, can work closely together for mutual benefit. Indeed, it's already happening, albeit on a modest scale. But to make a real difference, we're going to have to be serious about speaking, meeting, and working together at all levels. This involves much greater investment in diplomacy on the ground, and the British diplomatic budget is woefully thin. Stronger trade, investment and security links, partnership in health and education, and all this done in a spirit of cooperation rather than rivalry. Thank you.